Maria Santos never imagined she would hold a gun, let alone become one of the most feared fighters in her country's military history. Growing up in a small village nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, she spent her childhood helping her grandmother tend to wounded animals and learning traditional healing methods passed down through generations of women in her family. Her hands were meant for healing, everyone said. They were gentle hands that could coax a frightened bird back to health or carefully stitch together torn fabric with precision that amazed the local seamstress. Maria believed this too, until the war came crashing into her peaceful world like a thunderstorm that refused to pass. The conflict had been brewing for months in the capital city, but it felt like something happening in another world entirely. The villagers heard whispers of political unrest, of military coups and government overthrows, but these seemed like distant problems that belonged to people in suits and uniforms, not to farmers and shopkeepers who worried more about the harvest than politics. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in late September when Maria was walking to the market with her younger brother Carlos. The sound came first, a low rumbling that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Then came the dust clouds on the horizon, growing larger and darker as they approached the village. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late to run. The rebel forces swept through the village like a plague of locusts, taking whatever they wanted and destroying what they couldn't use. Maria watched in horror as neighbors who had known each other for decades were forced to choose sides in a conflict they barely understood. Some joined willingly, convinced by promises of better lives and fair treatment. Others were dragged away screaming, their families left behind to wonder if they would ever see their loved ones again. Maria's father tried to protect his family by declaring neutrality, insisting they were simple people who wanted no part in politics or war. But neutrality was a luxury the rebels couldn't afford to allow. Every person who wasn't with them was considered against them, and there was no middle ground in their black and white world. When they came for Carlos, Maria felt something break inside her chest. Her 16-year-old brother was barely old enough to shave, let alone carry a rifle and march into battle. But the rebels saw only another pair of hands, another body to throw into their growing army. They grabbed him by the arms and began dragging him toward their trucks, ignoring his protests and his family's desperate pleas. Without thinking, Maria threw herself between the soldiers and her brother. She was small, barely reaching the shoulders of most men, but she planted herself in front of Carlos like a tree that refused to be uprooted. The lead soldier, a scarred man with dead eyes, backhanded her so hard she tasted blood. But, instead of falling, instead of backing down, Maria stood up straighter and stared him down with a defiance that surprised everyone, including herself. "You want fighters?" she said, wiping blood from her split lip. "Take me instead. I'm stronger than he is." The soldier laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. But something in Maria's eyes made him pause. There was a fire there, a determination that couldn't be faked or taught. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he nodded to his men. They released Carlos and grabbed Maria instead, throwing her into the back of a truck with a dozen other reluctant recruits. As the truck pulled away from her village, Maria caught one last glimpse of her family standing in their doorway. Her mother was crying, her father looked defeated, and Carlos was staring after the truck with guilt written across his young face. Maria pressed her palm against the dirty window and made a silent promise that she would find a way back to them, no matter what it took. The rebel camp was a sprawling collection of tents, makeshift buildings, and commandeered vehicles spread across a valley that had once been farmland. Everything smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and the acrid smoke from countless campfires. The new recruits were herded into a large tent where they waited for hours without food or water, listening to the sounds of military training echoing across the camp. When night fell, they were finally given bowls of thin soup and chunks of stale bread. Maria ate mechanically, her mind already working on potential escape plans. She studied the guards' routines, noted which areas of the camp were well lit and which remained in shadow, memorized the sounds that indicated shift changes and meal times. But escape proved impossible. The camp was surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides and a river on the 4th. Guards patrolled constantly, and anyone caught trying to leave was brought back and made an example of in front of the other recruits. Maria watched in silent horror as a boy not much older than Carlos was beaten unconscious for attempting to slip away during the night. After that, the other recruits stopped talking about escape and started focusing on survival. Training began before dawn the next day. The rebels didn't waste time with gentle introductions or gradual conditioning. They threw the recruits into intensive physical training, weapons instruction, and tactical exercises that left everyone exhausted and sore. Many of the new soldiers were farmers or shopkeepers who had never held anything more dangerous than a kitchen knife, but the instructors showed no mercy for their inexperience. Maria struggled with the physical demands at first. She was strong from years of farm work, but military training required a different kind of strength and endurance. Her hands, so careful and gentle when healing injured animals, felt clumsy and uncertain when wrapped around the grip of an assault rifle. The weapon seemed to weigh as much as a small tree, and the recoil from firing it left her shoulder bruised and aching. But she was determined to excel, not because she believed in the rebel cause, but because she understood that competence meant survival. Incompetent soldiers were expendable, used as cannon fodder in the most dangerous missions. Skilled fighters, on the other hand, were valuable assets who received better food, better equipment, and better treatment. So Maria pushed herself harder than anyone else in her training group. While other recruits collapsed from exhaustion, she kept running. When others gave up on difficult exercises, she persisted until she got them right. She studied military manuals by candlelight, memorized the specifications of every weapon in their arsenal, and practiced tactical scenarios in her head until they became second nature. Her determination didn't go unnoticed. Sergeant Rodriguez, the gruff veteran who oversaw training for new recruits, began paying special attention to Maria's progress. He was a career soldier who had served in 3 different conflicts before joining the rebels, and he recognized something special in the young woman who had volunteered to take her brother's place. "You've got potential, Santos," he told her one evening after she had successfully completed a particularly challenging exercise. "But potential means nothing without discipline. The battlefield doesn't care about your good intentions or your noble motives. It only cares about whether you can follow orders and keep your squad alive." Rodriguez became Maria's unofficial mentor, teaching her lessons that went far beyond what was covered in regular training. He showed her how to read terrain and weather patterns, how to anticipate enemy movements, how to make life or death decisions in the space of a heartbeat. Most importantly, he taught her that being a good soldier meant protecting the people fighting beside you, even when you disagreed with the reasons you were fighting. "You think you're different from the rest of us," Rodriguez observed during one of their evening sessions. "You think you're here by accident, that you don't belong in this war. But nobody belongs in war, Santos. We all end up here because life backed us into a corner and fighting was the only way out. The question isn't whether you belong here. The question is what you're going to do now that you are here." As weeks turned into months, Maria found herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. Her hands, once soft from healing work, became calloused from gripping weapons and climbing over obstacles. Her body grew lean and muscular from constant physical training. Her mind became sharper, more analytical, constantly assessing threats and opportunities with the cold calculation of a professional soldier. But, perhaps most significantly, she began to understand the complex political situation that had created this conflict in the first place. The rebels weren't simply criminals or terrorists, as the government propaganda claimed. Many of them were farmers and workers who had been pushed to desperation by corrupt officials and unfair policies. They were fighting for their families, their communities, their very survival in a system that had failed them completely. This didn't make her agree with their methods or support their cause, but it helped her understand why so many people had chosen to take up arms. War was rarely about good versus evil, Rodriguez explained. It was usually about different groups of people trying to protect what they loved from other groups of people trying to do the same thing. Maria's first real test came during a routine patrol mission 6 months after her arrival at the camp. She was part of a small squad tasked with checking on supply routes and gathering intelligence about government forces in the area. It was supposed to be a safe assignment, perfect for relatively new soldiers who weren't yet ready for direct combat. The squad was led by Lieutenant Vasquez, a young officer who had impressed his superiors with his tactical knowledge and leadership potential. Vasquez was everything Maria wasn't: tall, confident, born into a military family, and absolutely certain that the rebel cause was righteous and just. He treated her with the polite respect due to a competent subordinate, but she could tell he didn't quite know what to make of her. The patrol started smoothly enough. They moved through familiar territory, checking in with local contacts and gathering information about government troop movements. Maria found herself enjoying the work despite herself. There was something satisfying about moving through the landscape with purpose and skill, about being part of a team that functioned like a well-oiled machine. But, as they prepared to head back to camp, everything went wrong at once. A government patrol had spotted them and called for reinforcements. Within minutes, the quiet valley they were crossing erupted into chaos as helicopters appeared overhead and soldiers emerged from concealed positions among the trees. The rebel squad found themselves trapped in an open field with nowhere to hide and no clear escape route. Government forces had them surrounded and were closing in from multiple directions. Lieutenant Vasquez tried to coordinate a fighting withdrawal, but the situation was deteriorating too quickly for organized tactics. Maria watched in growing horror as her squadmates fell one by one. These were people she had trained with, eaten with, shared stories and fears with during long nights in the camp. Now they were dying in the mud while bullets whistled overhead and explosions shook the ground beneath their feet. When a mortar round exploded near Lieutenant Vasquez, the blast threw him 20 feet and left him motionless in a crater that still smoked from the impact. Maria saw government soldiers advancing toward his position and realized they would capture or kill him within minutes unless someone acted immediately. Without thinking about the danger, without considering the odds or calculating the risks, Maria sprinted across the open ground toward her fallen commander. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet and buzzed past her head like angry insects, but somehow none of them found their mark. She reached Vasquez just as the first government soldier came within sight of his position. The lieutenant was unconscious but breathing, blood trickling from a head wound where shrapnel had grazed his scalp. Maria quickly checked for other injuries, her grandmother's healing knowledge combining with her military training to give her a rapid but thorough assessment. He had a concussion and probably some broken ribs, but nothing that would kill him if they could get him to safety. Getting him to safety, however, seemed impossible. Government forces were advancing from 3 sides, and Maria could hear their voices getting closer with each passing second. She looked around desperately for some way to escape, some tactical advantage she could exploit, but found nothing except open ground and approaching enemies. That's when she noticed Lieutenant Vasquez's sidearm, still holstered at his hip despite the explosion that had knocked him unconscious. Maria stared at the weapon for a long moment, knowing that picking it up would change everything. Once she took that gun, she would no longer be just a reluctant recruit following orders. She would become an active participant in this war, making life and death decisions that would haunt her forever. But, as the voices of the government soldiers grew louder and closer, Maria realized she didn't really have a choice. She could let them capture or kill Lieutenant Vasquez, or she could fight back and hope they could both survive long enough for rescue to arrive. When she thought of it that way, the decision became surprisingly easy. Maria drew the lieutenant's pistol and checked to make sure it was loaded. The weapon felt different in her hands than the rifles she had trained with, smaller, more personal, somehow more real. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and prepared to discover what she was truly capable of when everything she cared about was on the line. The first government soldier came around the corner of a large boulder just as Maria finished checking Lieutenant Vasquez's pulse. He was young, maybe her own age, with nervous eyes that darted constantly between his rifle scope and the terrain around him. For a split second, their eyes met across the 20 feet of rocky ground that separated them, and Maria saw her own fear reflected in his face. Neither of them wanted to be here. Neither of them had chosen this moment or this conflict. But circumstances had brought them to this point where one of them would live and one would die, and there was no time for hesitation or second thoughts. Maria's first shot took the soldier in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the rocks. She had aimed for center mass, the way Rodriguez had taught her, but her hands were shaking and the unfamiliar pistol pulled slightly to the left. The soldier dropped behind cover, clutching his wounded arm and shouting for backup. Within seconds, the entire area erupted with gunfire. Government forces had pinpointed Maria's position and were concentrating their fire on the crater where she crouched beside Lieutenant Vasquez. Bullets chipped fragments from the rocks around her and whistled overhead with deadly precision. She pressed herself as low as possible, trying to shield the unconscious lieutenant with her own body while returning fire whenever she spotted a target. The pistol had 15 rounds, and Maria counted each shot as she fired it. 12 rounds left. 11. 10. She was a good shot, Rodriguez had always said so, but she was outnumbered at least 10-1 and armed with a weapon designed for close combat, not long-range fighting. Every bullet had to count because there would be no opportunity to reload. A grenade landed in the crater, bouncing once before settling in the dirt just 3 feet from Lieutenant Vasquez's head. Maria threw herself on top of the explosive, wrapping her arms around it and pulling it against her chest. She had maybe 2 seconds before it detonated, not enough time to throw it clear but possibly enough to absorb most of the blast with her own body. The grenade was a dud. Maria lay there for several heartbeats, waiting to die, before realizing that nothing was going to happen. Either the firing mechanism had failed or it had been damaged during the bouncing landing. She carefully set it aside and resumed firing at the advancing soldiers, but her hands were shaking so badly now that she could barely hold the pistol steady. 7 rounds left. 6. 5. Government forces were closing in from multiple directions, and Maria could see there was no way she could hold them off much longer. Lieutenant Vasquez was starting to regain consciousness, groaning softly and trying to sit up despite his injuries. If they were going to die here, at least he would be awake for it. "Stay down," Maria whispered, pushing him back to the ground with one hand while continuing to fire with the other. "They haven't gotten us yet." "Santos?" The lieutenant's voice was thick and confused, but his eyes were starting to focus. "What happened? Where is everyone?" "Dead or scattered," Maria replied honestly. "It's just us now." Lieutenant Vasquez tried to reach for his sidearm, then realized Maria was holding it. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding as he processed the situation they were in. He had been unconscious for the initial attack and rescue, but the sound of gunfire and Maria's position told him everything he needed to know about what had happened. "How many rounds left?" he asked, his training overriding the pain and disorientation. 3, Maria answered, squeezing off another shot at a soldier who had gotten too bold in his advance. 2. The lieutenant nodded grimly. Standard military procedure in their situation was clear: save the last bullet for yourself rather than allow capture. Both of them had heard the stories about what happened to rebel prisoners, especially female fighters who had killed government soldiers. Death in battle was preferable to what awaited them in interrogation cells. But, as Maria prepared to fire her final shot, she heard a sound that changed everything: the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery shells. For a moment, she thought the government forces were preparing to finish them off with heavy weapons. Then, she realized the trajectory was wrong. The shells were falling on the government positions, not on her crater. The rebel cavalry had arrived. Rodriguez appeared at the edge of the crater like an avenging angel, his assault rifle chattering as he laid down covering fire for the advancing rebel counterattack. Behind him came a full squad of seasoned fighters who moved through the government positions like professionals, coordinating their advance with practiced efficiency. "Time to go, Santos," Rodriguez shouted over the noise of battle. "Can you move the lieutenant?" Maria looked down at Vasquez, who was struggling to sit up despite his obvious injuries. "Can you walk?" she asked. "I can try," he replied, though his face was pale and his hands were shaking from the concussion. Maria helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight as they climbed out of the crater. Rodriguez covered their retreat while other rebels dealt with the remaining government forces. The rescue had arrived just in time, but Maria knew that without her intervention, Lieutenant Vasquez would have been dead or captured long before help could reach them. The journey back to camp took most of the night. Lieutenant Vasquez needed frequent rest stops, and the group had to take a circuitous route to avoid government patrols that were still searching the area. But Rodriguez kept them moving steadily, and by dawn they were back within the relative safety of the rebel-controlled territory. Word of Maria's actions spread through the camp like wildfire. The story grew with each telling, becoming more dramatic and heroic as it passed from one soldier to another. By the time it reached the camp commander, Maria had supposedly held off an entire government company single-handedly while carrying her wounded officer to safety through a hail of bullets and explosions. The truth was impressive enough without embellishment. A relative newcomer had risked her life to save a superior officer, successfully held a defensive position against overwhelming odds, and demonstrated the kind of courage and tactical thinking that marked a natural soldier. In an army that was always short of competent leaders, Maria's performance had not gone unnoticed by the higher command. Colonel Mendoza, the camp commander, summoned Maria to his tent 3 days after the rescue mission. She had never spoken directly to such a high-ranking officer before, and she approached the meeting with considerable nervousness. The colonel was a legendary figure in the rebel army, a former government general who had defected when he could no longer stomach the corruption and brutality of the regime. "Sit down, Santos," he said, gesturing to a simple wooden chair across from his field desk. "I've been hearing interesting things about your performance during the patrol incident." Maria remained standing at attention. "I only did what was necessary, sir." "Necessary." The colonel smiled slightly. "That's an interesting word choice. Most soldiers would say they did what was right, or what was brave, or what duty required. But you say it was necessary. Why?" The question caught Maria off guard. She had expected to be commended or perhaps questioned about tactical details, not asked to explain her motivations. She thought carefully before answering. "Because Lieutenant Vasquez was a good officer who cared about his soldiers," she said finally. "Because leaving him would have meant the government forces learned our patrol routes and procedures. Because the squad needed a leader to coordinate the retreat, even if he was unconscious at the time." Colonel Mendoza nodded approvingly. "Practical reasons. Not romantic notions about heroism or glory, but cold calculations about what the situation required. That's the mark of a good soldier, Santos. Heroes get themselves killed performing grand gestures. Professional soldiers do whatever is necessary to complete the mission and bring their people home alive." He opened a folder on his desk and studied its contents for several moments. Maria could see it contained what appeared to be her service record, though she was surprised there was enough information to fill multiple pages. "Your instructors report that you're an exceptional marksman," the colonel continued. "Your physical fitness scores are in the top 5%. You've demonstrated leadership potential and the ability to make sound decisions under pressure. These are valuable qualities in any soldier, but particularly valuable in someone with your background." "My background, sir?" "You're not a career military officer or a political true believer," Colonel Mendoza explained. "You joined our cause for personal reasons, to protect your family. That gives you a different perspective than soldiers who grew up dreaming of military glory or who see this war as an ideological crusade. You understand that war is a tool, not a goal in itself." The colonel closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "I'm promoting you to sergeant and transferring you to Lieutenant Vasquez's unit as his second-in-command. He specifically requested you for the position, and I think it's a good match. He has the tactical knowledge and leadership training you lack, while you have the practical experience and clear thinking he sometimes lacks." Maria felt a mix of pride and apprehension. The promotion was recognition of her abilities, but it also meant greater responsibility and greater danger. Sergeants were expected to lead from the front, to make decisions that could mean life or death for entire squads. She wasn't sure she was ready for that kind of responsibility. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" she asked. "Granted. I'm not sure I'm qualified to be a sergeant. I've been in the army for less than a year, and most of that was training. I don't know if I can handle the responsibility of leading other soldiers." Colonel Mendoza studied her for a long moment. "Do you know why I defected from the government army, Santos?" "No, sir." "Because I spent 20 years following orders from officers who were appointed based on political connections rather than competence. I watched good soldiers die because their commanders made decisions based on what would advance their careers rather than what would win battles. I don't want that for this army." He stood up and walked to the tent entrance, gazing out at the bustling activity of the camp. Competence is rare, Santos. Real leadership ability is even rarer. When I find someone who has both qualities, I don't waste time worrying about whether they've checked all the traditional boxes. I put them where they can do the most good. The promotion ceremony was held that evening in front of the entire camp. Maria stood at attention while Colonel Mendoza pinned the sergeant's stripes to her uniform and read the citation describing her actions during the rescue mission. The assembled soldiers cheered and applauded, but Maria felt oddly detached from the celebration. She was thinking about the government's soldier she had wounded, wondering whether he had survived and whether he had family waiting for him at home. She was thinking about her own family, still living in their village and probably wondering whether she was alive or dead. Most of all, she was thinking about the weight of the pistol in her holster and the knowledge that she would probably have to use it again soon. Lieutenant Vasquez approached her after the ceremony, moving carefully due to his still healing injuries. "Congratulations, Sergeant," he said with a smile. "I look forward to working with you." "Thank you, sir," Maria replied. "I hope I can live up to your expectations." "You already have," he assured her. "But I have a feeling this is just the beginning. The government is planning a major offensive, and they're going to need every skilled soldier we can field. Your real test is still coming." That night, Maria lay in her bunk and stared at the canvas ceiling of her tent. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the camp settling down for the night, soldiers talking quietly around campfires, sentries calling out passwords, the distant sound of radio communications from the command tent. 6 months ago, she had been a village girl whose greatest concern was helping her grandmother with the herb garden. Now she was a sergeant in a rebel army, responsible for leading soldiers into battle against trained government forces. The transformation seemed impossible, like something that had happened to someone else entirely. But, as she drifted off to sleep, Maria found herself thinking not about the past or the future, but about the moment when she had made the decision to pick up Lieutenant Vasquez's pistol. In that instant, she had discovered something about herself that she never would have learned in her peaceful village life. She had learned that when everything she cared about was on the line, she was capable of fighting back. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities to prove herself. The government offensive that Lieutenant Vasquez had mentioned was indeed coming, and it would test every soldier in the rebel army. But tonight, for the first time since joining the rebels, Maria Santos felt ready for whatever came next. She had found her gun. More importantly, she had found her courage. And, in a war where both were in short supply, that made her more valuable than any traditional military training or political ideology ever could. The legend of Maria Santos was just beginning, though she didn't know it yet. In the months to come, her name would become known throughout both armies, spoken with respect by her allies and fear by her enemies. But, that night, she was simply a young woman who had discovered she could be brave when bravery was needed most. The war would test that bravery again and again in the days ahead. And, each time, Maria would prove that sometimes the most unlikely warriors become the most formidable ones of all. The government offensive began 3 weeks after Maria's promotion, launched with a ferocity that caught even the rebel leadership by surprise. Intelligence reports had suggested a major operation was being planned, but no one had anticipated the scale or coordination of the attack that swept across rebel-controlled territory like a hurricane. Government forces struck simultaneously at 6 different locations, using a combination of airborne troops, mechanized infantry, and artillery support that demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication the rebels had not seen before. Within hours, 2 major rebel strongholds had fallen, and communication lines between scattered units were being systematically destroyed. Maria's unit, now officially designated as Lieutenant Vasquez's Reconnaissance and Rapid Response Squad, found themselves at the center of the chaos. Their assignment was to move between threatened positions, gather intelligence on government movements, and provide tactical support wherever it was needed most. It was exactly the kind of flexible, high-risk mission that suited Maria's particular combination of skills. Their first major engagement came at dawn on the second day of the offensive. A government armored column was advancing toward one of the rebel supply depots, and Maria's squad was tasked with conducting a delaying action until heavier rebel forces could be repositioned. The mission called for hit-and-run tactics against a superior force, the kind of operation that required perfect timing and flawless execution. Lieutenant Vasquez positioned the squad on a ridge overlooking the main road, where they could observe the approaching column and strike at vehicles as they passed through a narrow valley. Maria took point with the squad's sniper rifle, a precision weapon she had been training with for months but had never used in actual combat. Through the rifle's scope, she could see the government convoy clearly, 6 armored personnel carriers escorted by 2 tanks, with infantry soldiers walking alongside the vehicles in standard protective formation. It was a textbook military advance, well coordinated and professionally executed. The kind of target that could destroy an inexperienced squad if they made any mistakes. "Remember the plan," Lieutenant Vasquez whispered into his radio. "Santos takes out the lead vehicle, then we hit them with everything we have for 30 seconds and withdraw. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We delay them, we don't try to destroy them." Maria centered her crosshairs on the lead tank's vision block, knowing that a well-placed shot could blind the crew and force them to halt the entire column. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger as she controlled her breathing the way Rodriguez had taught her. Inhale, exhale, natural pause, squeeze smoothly through the pause. The shot was perfect. The high-powered rifle round struck the tank's periscope housing with devastating effect, sending fragments of glass and metal flying into the crew compartment. The massive vehicle lurched to a halt as the driver lost visibility, and the entire convoy bunched up behind it in momentary confusion. That moment of confusion was all Maria's squad needed. Rocket-propelled grenades slammed into the sides of 2 personnel carriers, while concentrated rifle fire raked the infantry formations. The government soldiers scattered for cover, but they were caught in open ground with nowhere to hide effectively. For exactly 30 seconds, the squad poured devastating fire into the trapped convoy. Then, as planned, they melted away into the forest before the government forces could organize a counterattack. By the time helicopters arrived to provide air support, Maria's squad was already 2 miles away and moving to their next position. The delaying action was a complete success, but it was only the beginning. Over the next week, Maria's squad conducted a dozen similar operations, striking at government supply lines, communication centers, and isolated outposts. They moved constantly, never staying in one position long enough for enemy forces to track them down, always appearing where they were least expected. Maria quickly discovered that she had a natural talent for this kind of warfare. Her instincts about enemy movements were almost supernatural in their accuracy. She could look at a map and immediately identify the most likely routes for government advances, the best positions for ambushes, and the escape routes that would be available if things went wrong. More importantly, she had developed an ability to think like her enemies. Having been forced into military service herself, she understood how government soldiers would react under stress, what mistakes they were likely to make, and how their training could be used against them. This insight made her squad's operations devastatingly effective. The other members of the squad began to look to Maria for tactical advice, even though Lieutenant Vasquez remained the official commander. There was something about her calm confidence under fire, her ability to make quick decisions based on incomplete information, that inspired trust in veteran soldiers who had been fighting for years. Corporal Martinez, a grizzled veteran who had initially been skeptical of serving under such a young sergeant, became one of Maria's strongest supporters after she successfully led the squad out of a government ambush that should have killed them all. Private Chen, barely 18 years old and fighting in his first major campaign, started following Maria around like a devoted younger brother, eager to learn from someone he saw as a tactical genius. But it was during the Battle of San Miguel that Maria truly earned her legendary status. The small mountain town was one of the last rebel strongholds in the region, and government forces had surrounded it with overwhelming strength. The rebel garrison was trapped with nowhere to retreat, facing annihilation unless reinforcements could break through the government siege lines. Colonel Mendoza personally led a relief force towards San Miguel, but the government had anticipated this response and positioned artillery and air support to stop any rescue attempt. 3 previous relief efforts had been destroyed before they could reach the besieged town, and it seemed that the garrison was doomed. That's when Lieutenant Vasquez proposed a desperate plan that relied entirely on Maria's unique abilities. Instead of trying to fight through the government's siege lines, a small infiltration team would slip through enemy positions under cover of darkness and coordinate a breakout from inside the town. The mission required someone who could move undetected through hostile territory, assess the tactical situation on the ground, and organize the trapped defenders for a coordinated escape. It was exactly the kind of impossible mission that Maria had been preparing for her entire military career without realizing it. Every skill she had developed, every lesson she had learned, every instinct she had honed would be needed for success. And failure would mean not just her own death, but the destruction of an entire rebel garrison. The infiltration team consisted of just 4 people: Maria, Lieutenant Vasquez, Corporal Martinez, and Private Chen. They approached San Miguel through a network of mountain trails that Maria had identified using aerial reconnaissance photos and local knowledge from refugees who had escaped the siege. The route was treacherous, requiring them to climb over rocky terrain in complete darkness while avoiding government patrol positions. Maria led the way, using skills she had learned during childhood expeditions with her father to navigate the difficult terrain. She could read the mountain landscape like a familiar book, identifying safe paths and dangerous areas by subtle changes in vegetation, rock formations, and wind patterns that would have been invisible to someone without her background. The team reached the outskirts of San Miguel just before dawn, concealing themselves in a cluster of abandoned buildings that overlooked the government siege positions. Through binoculars, Maria could see that the situation was worse than intelligence reports had suggested. The government forces had completely encircled the town with multiple layers of defensive positions, while artillery positions on surrounding hills could cover every possible escape route. Inside the town, smoke was rising from several buildings that had been hit by artillery strikes. The rebel garrison was clearly under severe pressure, and Maria estimated they had perhaps 24 hours before their ammunition ran out completely. Any rescue attempt would have to be coordinated perfectly, with split-second timing and flawless execution. Lieutenant Vasquez studied the government positions through his own binoculars, comparing what he saw with the tactical maps they had brought. "It's impossible," he concluded after several minutes. "They've got overlapping fields of fire covering every approach. Even if we could get the garrison organized, they'd be cut down the moment they tried to break out." But Maria was seeing something different. Her months of combat experience had taught her to look beyond the obvious tactical situation and identify weaknesses that might not be apparent at first glance. She noticed that the government artillery positions were arranged to provide maximum coverage of the valley approaches, but they couldn't depress their guns low enough to cover the steep ravine that ran along the eastern side of town. More importantly, she realized that the government commanders were thinking like conventional soldiers, positioning their forces to stop a traditional breakout attempt. They weren't prepared for something completely unexpected, something that violated standard military doctrine so completely that they wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. "There's a way," she told Lieutenant Vasquez. "But it's going to require the garrison to do something that goes against everything they've been taught about military tactics." She outlined her plan using the detailed maps they had brought, showing how a coordinated diversionary attack could draw government attention away from the true escape route. The key was timing. The garrison would have to launch what appeared to be a suicidal frontal assault at exactly the right moment, drawing government forces out of position and creating a brief window for the real escape. Lieutenant Vasquez listened to the plan with growing amazement. It was brilliant in its audacity, requiring precise coordination between forces that had no way to communicate directly. It would also require the garrison commander to trust completely in Maria's tactical judgment, gambling the lives of his entire force on the calculations of a sergeant he had never met. "How do we get word to them about the plan?" Corporal Martinez asked. "The government is jamming all radio frequencies, and any messenger we send would have to cross their lines in broad daylight." Maria smiled for the first time since beginning the mission. "We don't need to send them a message," she said. "We're going to deliver it personally." The plan she proposed was so audacious that it left the rest of the team speechless. Maria intended to infiltrate the town itself, make contact with the garrison commander, and coordinate the breakout from inside the siege lines. It meant crossing through government positions twice, first to get into the town and then to get back out with the escaping rebels. "That's suicide," Lieutenant Vasquez protested. "Even if you make it into town without being detected, how do you expect to get out again? The government will be watching every possible exit." "Not if they're too busy dealing with what they think is a major breakout attempt," Maria replied. Remember, they're expecting the garrison to try something desperate. When we give them exactly what they're expecting, they'll react according to their training and move their reserves to counter the obvious threat. That's when we hit them from the direction they're not watching. The infiltration would have to wait until nightfall, giving Maria time to study the government positions in detail and identify the best approach route. She spent the day moving carefully between observation points, memorizing patrol schedules, guard rotations, and the layout of defensive positions. By evening, she had developed a detailed plan for reaching the town center without being detected. As darkness fell, Maria prepared for what she knew could be her final mission. She stripped down to the essential equipment: a knife, a pistol with 2 spare magazines, a compact radio, and the maps showing her planned escape route. Everything else was extra weight that could slow her down or make noise at a crucial moment. Lieutenant Vasquez watched her final preparations with obvious concern. "You don't have to do this, Santos," he said. "We could try to find another way, or wait for reinforcements." "There is no other way," Maria replied simply. "And there's no time to wait. Those people in there are depending on us, just like I depended on you and Rodriguez when I was trapped and outnumbered. Sometimes you have to take risks to do what's right." She moved out into the darkness, leaving her teammates hidden among the abandoned buildings. Ahead lay the most dangerous mission of her military career, requiring her to slip past trained soldiers who would kill her instantly if they detected her presence. But Maria felt strangely calm as she approached the government lines. For the first time since joining the rebel army, she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she had been trained to do. Everything in her life had led to this moment: her childhood in the mountains, her grandmother's lessons about healing, her military training, her combat experience, and her growing reputation as a tactical genius. Tonight, she would either save an entire garrison or die trying. Either way, the shy village girl who had once dreamed only of healing wounded animals was about to become a legend that would be remembered long after the war ended. The government sentries never saw her coming. Maria moved through the government lines like a ghost, using every shadow and depression in the terrain to remain invisible. Her childhood experience tracking animals through mountain forests served her well now, as she read the landscape with an intuition that years of military training could never have taught her. She knew instinctively which patches of ground would support her weight silently, which routes would keep her downwind of the guard dogs, and where the sentry's attention would be focused. The closest call came when she had to cross a 30-foot stretch of open ground between 2 defensive positions. Government soldiers were stationed at either end, their night vision equipment sweeping the area in regular patterns. Maria timed their movements for 20 minutes, noting the exact rhythm of their surveillance routine, before making her move during a brief gap in coverage. She crawled across the exposed ground on her belly, moving inches at a time and freezing completely whenever she heard voices or footsteps. The crossing took 45 minutes, and by the time she reached the cover of a damaged stone wall on the far side, her uniform was soaked with sweat despite the cool mountain air. The final approach to the town center required her to navigate through a maze of rubble-filled streets, collapsed buildings, and improvised barricades that the rebel garrison had constructed during weeks of siege warfare. Government snipers controlled most of the main thoroughfares, forcing Maria to move through basements, sewers, and damaged buildings that provided concealment from observation. She finally reached the rebel command post just after midnight, emerging from a bombed-out shop into the basement where the garrison commander had established his headquarters. The rebels nearly shot her before she could identify herself, so unexpected was her arrival through lines they had thought were impenetrable. Major Herrera, the garrison commander, was a veteran officer who had been fighting government forces for over 3 years. When Maria explained her presence and outlined her evacuation plan, he listened with the careful attention of a professional soldier who understood exactly how desperate their situation had become. "Your plan requires my entire force to act as bait for a diversionary attack," he observed after she had finished her briefing. "We would be exposing ourselves to concentrated enemy fire with no guarantee that your escape route will actually work. If you're wrong about the government response, we'll all be dead within minutes." "Yes, sir," Maria acknowledged. "But if we do nothing, you'll all be dead within hours anyway. The government is preparing for a final assault at dawn. I saw the preparations during my approach. They're moving heavy weapons into position for a coordinated strike that will level this entire area." Major Herrera studied the maps Maria had brought, comparing her proposed escape route with his own knowledge of the local terrain. After several minutes, he nodded slowly. It could work, he admitted. The timing would have to be perfect, and we'd need to coordinate our movements without any direct communication. But it's the first plan I've heard that offers any real chance of getting my people out alive. The preparations took most of the remaining night hours. Major Herrera's force consisted of 43 soldiers and a dozen wounded who would have to be carried during the evacuation. They had enough ammunition for perhaps 2 hours of intense fighting, after which they would be reduced to hand-to-hand combat against overwhelmingly superior numbers. Maria helped organize the force into 3 groups: a diversionary unit that would launch the fake frontal assault, a main evacuation group that would move the wounded and essential supplies along the escape route, and a rear guard that would cover the withdrawal and prevent government forces from following too closely. She also spent time studying the garrison's defensive positions, identifying additional improvements that could be made during the few hours remaining before dawn. Her suggestions impressed the veteran soldiers, who recognized tactical insights that came from extensive combat experience rather than textbook knowledge. "Where did you learn to read terrain like that?" asked Sergeant Villa, Major Herrera's second-in-command. "I've been fighting in these mountains for 5 years, and I didn't see half the defensive possibilities you've identified. I grew up in country like this," Maria explained. "My father taught me to track deer and wild boar through forests where one wrong step could send you over a cliff. You learn to see things that aren't obvious, to understand how the land flows and where the hidden dangers are." As dawn approached, Maria prepared to make her way back to Lieutenant Vasquez's position, where she would coordinate the external part of the operation. But, before leaving, she had one more conversation with Major Herrera that would prove crucial to the mission's success. "Your reputation has reached us even here," the major told her as they reviewed the final timing for the breakout. "The soldiers call you La Fantasma, the ghost, because you appear and disappear from battlefields like something supernatural. But I can see you're just a soldier who understands how to use her strengths effectively." Maria was surprised to learn that she had acquired a nickname among the rebels, though she supposed it was inevitable given the stories that circulated after each successful mission. Soldiers needed heroes and legends to maintain morale during difficult campaigns, and her unconventional background made her a natural candidate for mythologizing. "The important thing is that the soldiers believe in the plan," she replied. "If they have confidence in what we're doing, they'll execute their parts perfectly even under the worst conditions. Doubt gets people killed faster than enemy bullets." She slipped out of the town the same way she had entered, moving through the network of damaged buildings and underground passages that she had mapped during her infiltration. But the return journey was complicated by the approach of dawn and increased government patrol activity as the siege forces prepared for their final assault. Maria had to detour twice to avoid patrol units, adding precious minutes to her travel time. When she finally reached the observation post where Lieutenant Vasquez waited, the eastern horizon was already showing the first pale light of sunrise. The operation would have to begin within minutes if it was to succeed. "Thank God," Lieutenant Vasquez breathed as Maria materialized out of the shadows. "I was beginning to think we'd lost you. Is the garrison ready?" "They're ready," Maria confirmed, checking her watch and calculating the remaining time before the government assault began. "Major Herrera will launch his diversionary attack in exactly 12 minutes. That should give us the window we need to position ourselves for the evacuation." The next hour unfolded with the precision of a military exercise, despite the chaos and violence that surrounded every phase of the operation. At exactly 6:15 a.m., the rebel garrison launched what appeared to be a desperate frontal assault against the government's siege lines, complete with covering fire from their remaining artillery pieces and coordinated infantry attacks at multiple points. The government response was immediate and overwhelming. Artillery fire rained down on the rebel positions while helicopter gunships swept in to strafe the attacking infantry. Reserves moved forward to reinforce threatened sections of the siege line, exactly as Maria had predicted they would. But, while government attention was focused on stopping the obvious breakout attempt, Maria and her team were guiding the real evacuation group through the ravine that ran along the eastern edge of town. The wounded were carried on improvised stretchers, while able-bodied soldiers provided security and helped navigate the difficult terrain. The escape route was everything Maria had hoped it would be: invisible from government observation posts, sheltered from artillery fire by the steep walls of the ravine, and leading directly to rebel-controlled territory beyond the siege perimeter. The government forces, committed to stopping what they thought was the main breakout attempt, never realized that their real objective was slipping away through terrain they had dismissed as impassable. By the time government commanders realized what was happening, it was too late to intercept the evacuation. Major Herrera's diversionary force had accomplished its mission and was conducting a fighting withdrawal to predetermined rally points, where they would rendezvous with the main group and continue the retreat to safety. The entire operation was completed in less than 3 hours, with minimal casualties and complete tactical success. An entire rebel garrison that should have been destroyed had been extracted intact, along with their weapons, wounded personnel, and valuable intelligence about government siege tactics. When Colonel Mendoza received the report of the mission's success, he immediately summoned Maria to his field headquarters. The operation at San Miguel had saved more than just 43 soldiers. It had preserved an experienced unit that could be redeployed to other critical positions and had demonstrated that government siege tactics could be defeated through superior planning and execution. "Sergeant Santos," the colonel began, "what you accomplished at San Miguel goes beyond exceptional military performance. You conceived and executed an operation that professional staff officers said was impossible, using tactical innovations that will be studied in military academies for years to come." Maria remained at attention, uncertain where the conversation was leading. Praise from senior officers was welcome, but she had learned to be wary of assignments that came with excessive compliments. "I'm promoting you to lieutenant and giving you command of a special operations unit," Colonel Mendoza continued. "Your mission will be to conduct raids, reconnaissance, and rescue operations throughout the region. You'll have complete tactical autonomy and the authority to recruit personnel from any unit in the army." The promotion was unprecedented for someone with Maria's limited experience, but her results spoke for themselves. In less than 18 months, she had evolved from reluctant recruit to one of the most effective officers in the rebel army. Her combination of tactical brilliance, natural leadership ability, and intimate knowledge of mountain terrain made her uniquely valuable for special operations work. Over the following months, Lieutenant Maria Santos and her hand-picked team conducted dozens of missions behind enemy lines. They rescued captured rebel officers from government prisons, destroyed supply depots and communication centers, and gathered intelligence that allowed rebel forces to anticipate and counter government offensives. But it was her weapon of choice that truly sealed her legendary status among both rebel and government forces. Maria had kept Lieutenant Vasquez's pistol after their first battle together, and she carried it on every subsequent mission. The weapon became her signature, a symbol of her transformation from village healer to elite warrior. The government put a substantial bounty on her head, and several elite units were assigned specifically to hunt her down. But Maria seemed to live up to her nickname of La Fantasma, appearing without warning to strike at vulnerable targets and vanishing before enemy forces could respond effectively. Stories of her exploits grew with each telling, embellished by soldiers who needed heroes to believe in and enemies who needed to explain their failures. She was credited with supernatural abilities, impossible feats of marksmanship, and tactical victories that defied conventional military wisdom. The truth was both simpler and more impressive than the legends suggested. Maria Santos had discovered that war brought out qualities she never knew she possessed: courage under fire, tactical brilliance, and the ability to inspire fierce loyalty in soldiers who would follow her into any danger. She had taken up arms to protect her family and community, but, in the process, she had become something larger than herself. She had become a symbol of resistance, proof that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges when everything they cared about was threatened. The war eventually ended, as all wars do, through a combination of military victory and political negotiation. Maria returned to her village to find that her reputation had preceded her. The shy girl who had once tended wounded animals was now spoken of in the same breath as legendary military leaders. But Maria herself remained largely unchanged by fame and acclaim. She used her veteran's pension to start a medical clinic in her village, returning to her original calling of healing rather than fighting. The pistol that had made her famous was retired to a place of honor above the clinic's main entrance, a reminder of the prices that must sometimes be paid for peace. Children who came to the clinic for treatment would stare at the weapon and ask their parents to tell them again about the legendary fighter who had saved her commander in battle and, then, used his gun to become one of the most feared warriors in the country's history. Maria would smile and redirect their attention to more peaceful topics, preferring to be remembered for the lives she saved rather than the battles she won. But, on quiet evenings, when the clinic was closed and the village settled into its familiar routines, Maria would sometimes take down the pistol and clean it carefully, remembering the weight of it in her hands and the moments when courage had been the difference between life and death. Those memories would always be with her, a part of her personal history that no amount of peaceful living could erase. She had been a healer, a warrior, and a legend. But, perhaps most importantly, she had been exactly what her people needed her to be when they needed it most. In a world that often seemed to offer only impossible choices, Maria Santos had found a way to be both gentle and fierce, both protective and deadly, both human and heroic. The gun that had made her famous was silent now, but the story it represented would live on in the hearts and minds of people who understood that sometimes ordinary individuals must do extraordinary things to protect what they love. And, in that understanding, the legend of Maria Santos would prove to be immortal.